Veteran Next Door. Here's your host, Randall Baxter.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
We all know that story. The bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. We all know the first ship that everybody learns about, the USS Arizona. That was our first great ship sunk, as far as what everybody knows or tells their story. But today we're going to be talking about the last ship sunk in World War II in the Pacific, the USS Indianapolis. We're also going to be talking about one of the sailors on board, a young man from Knoxville, Tennessee, Earl Henry. The Indianapolis was a heavy cruiser. It was built in 1930 by the New York Shipbuilding Corporation in Camden, New Jersey. In 1931-32, it was launched with a shakedown voyage to Guantanamo. July 1933, President Roosevelt went for a 2-day cruise with his cabinet on the USS Indianapolis. And in 1936, he took his third cruise on the same ship to South America. As tension grew, the crew was trained into a fighting machine. On the other side of the picture, the sailor was born in 1911. His name was Earl Henry. 14 years later, he lived in Knoxville, Tennessee. He was born in Clinton. He had learned to work with birds and had become a taxidermist. His birds were displayed on Gay Street at a sporting goods store in the 1930s. In 1939, he started painting. And then one day he decided he had to give up his taxidermy to become a dentist in 1935. In 1941, he joined the Navy Reserve. This is our story today. You're listening to The Veteran Next Door, and I'm your host, Randy Baxter, and we'll be right back.
The Veteran Next Door will return in a moment.
The call to serve. It has no sound, yet I have heard it. In the whispered retelling of honorable sacrifices made by those who have served before me. The call to serve has no form, yet I have clearly seen it. In the eyes of men and women infinitely more courageous and more driven than most. The call to serve has no weight, yet I have held it in my hands. I will commit to carry it close to my heart until my country is safe and the anguish of those less fortunate has been soothed. The call to serve is at once invisible and always present. And for those who choose to answer the call, for their country, for their fellow man, for themselves, it is the most powerful force on earth. America's Navy, a global force for good. To answer the call, go to Navy.com or call 1-800-USA-NAVY.
You're listening to The Veteran Next Door, and I'm your host, Randy Baxter. And my guest today is Earl Henry Jr. His father is the man I just described in the earlier segment, and he was 6 weeks old when his father passed away. Earl, your father was quite a bird watcher and a bird artist and a bird whistler. How did he ever get interested in birds?
He got interested in birds from collecting Arm & Hammer bird cards, and I know that seems strange to people today, but back then, and that would have been about 1923, at age 12, my father collected Arm & Hammer bird cards. They were very high-quality prints on cards, very much like baseball cards that I collected, with the image of the bird on one side, information about the bird on the other side. And my father and two of his neighborhood friends started collecting those cards. And this was the beginning of my father becoming interested in birds.
Okay, so we've got a young teenager in North Knoxville up on Scott Street. He's got radio to listen to. He doesn't have TV. He didn't have a lot of other things that we have today. So he got interested in birds, and he turned that interest in birds into becoming a taxidermist.
Yes, but now that was after having joined the Knoxville Bird Club, that is the Knoxville chapter of the Tennessee Ornithological Society, and being mentored by members of that club. And apparently he had the natural talents to become a really good birder, and I'm aware of them because they're skills that I don't have. One is he must have had excellent eyesight, and he must have had excellent hearing, because one of the things he quickly learned to do was to do imitations of bird calls, and ultimately he learned to do about 60 different bird call imitations.
Okay, and he's very good. We're going to hear some of them here in a few minutes. So he was interested in birds, he was interested in taxidermy, and he was leaving some of his work at a local sporting goods store.
Yes, and this was in the late 1930s. He loaned every year, every fall, some of the mounted ducks for the store display of a sporting goods store owned by Bob Birch. And Mr. Birch sold a lot of hunting paraphernalia, that is guns, shells, hunting jackets, that type of equipment to hunters. And in his store display, he would put corn shucks and the hunting equipment, and he would borrow some of my father's mounted ducks to put in the store display.
Okay, and then I think one day some of the displays came back and they were a little tattered and worn.
I imagine that those were things that my father noticed that nobody would have noticed except the person who had done the birds, but noticing that feathers were bent or missing, and so he decided he wasn't going to let Mr. Birch borrow the mounted ducks anymore. But Mr. Birch was such a good friend, he didn't really know how to tell him no. And the way my grandfather told it to me, he said, one day, I know what I'll do. I'll paint him some ducks. And so very quickly he started painting ducks for Bob Birch.
So the taxidermist bird caller became an artist to protect his previous work.
Right.
And then he was just painting some ducks, but he became very good at painting birds, didn't he?
Well, that was later. That was after my mother and father had married. They married in 1941. And it was right after they married that Pearl Harbor occurred, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And my father was already in the Navy Reserve. He had, and he was given orders to report to Parris Island, South Carolina. And that's where my mother and father lived for a year. And that's where the serious bird painting started. And my mother deserves the credit, a lot of the credit for that, because she encouraged him to paint. She said, why don't you paint more than just ducks? As it turned out, he never painted any more ducks. I'm sure he would have had he lived. But he started painting beautiful songbirds, shorebirds, birds of prey, marsh birds, and she also encouraged him to put as much emphasis in the background as he did in the birds, because his interest was the birds after all, and that tended to be his focus.
In 1941, the Indianapolis had left Pearl Harbor one day early to go on a bombing practice run. In 1942, in February, the Indianapolis fought its first action near Rabaul. We have talked about Rabaul before. That was in the South Pacific. Rabaul was a Japanese base that was standing in the way of MacArthur and his desire to cut off supplies to the Japanese nation by cutting off all their trade routes. Battle number 2 in 43, in March of 42, They assisted the Yorktown to attack New Guinea. They also, right after that, went back to San Francisco to be refitted and went on a trip to Alaska and in the Aleutian Islands to resist the Japanese who had taken over the islands up there. In February 1943, they sunk a Japanese ship up near the Aleutian Islands and it exploded when it was hit, so it was assumed that it was full of ammunition. The Indianapolis also served as a flagship for Admiral Spruance in his invasion of the Gilbert Islands. Battle number 7 is a very famous battle called Kwajalein that the Indianapolis participated in. Then the Western Carolines, and then they went to Saipan. So the USS Indianapolis, while Earl Henry was learning to be a taxidermist, well, he was a child then, but after he started painting his birds, had already fought in 9 battles before he ever arrived. This is The Veteran Next Door, and I'm your host, Randy Baxter, and we'll be right back.
The Veteran Next Door will return in a moment.
You're listening to some bird calls from Earl Henry that recorded in 1945, is that right?
44.
44. We want to use this segment to get to know Earl Henry, the sailor who was on the USS Indianapolis. But let's go back a little bit to his younger days. He learned to be a taxidermist, didn't he?
He learned to be a taxidermist while he was in high school, and this would maybe surprise most people, but he learned to do taxidermy through a correspondence course. It's hard for me to imagine people being able to learn that through taxidermy, but I know he had a natural gift to do detail with his hands. He may have been mentored by Mr. H.P. Imes of the Knoxville chapter of the Bird Club.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you bring up Mr. Imes' name. Can you tell me a little bit about his relationship with Mr. Imes? Well,
Mr. Imes, as I understand, was quite a naturalist. He was also an artist himself. And my father became a very close friend of his. And one of the things my mother told me about, and this is shortly after they got married in the fall of 1941, or maybe right before my father went on duty with the Navy in early 42, that they had dinner at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Imes. And one of the things that my father especially wanted to make sure my mother saw was a passenger pigeon that was in the possession of Mr. Imes. Now, the passenger pigeons were long extinct by that time, but this was one that he had purchased, one that had been shot by someone around 1850 in the area of Nashville.
Oh, so it was stuffed?
It was stuffed.
Okay. And tell me some more about Mr. Imes and his relationship to the city of Knoxville.
Well, Mr. Imes left his property, which is a lovely site for birding near where the Tennessee River is formed. It's just right below where the French Broad River and the Ocean River come together. It was a bird sanctuary, and he left this property to the city of Knoxville, and since then they have built a really state-of-the-art nature center, a large building there, and they have all kinds of programs, especially for youth. It is a very highly regarded institution here in Knoxville.
So people can go there and see your father's work?
Well, yes, because when they built the new center in the late 1990s, we donated my father's mounted bird collection. There are 87 of my father's mounted birds there, the rarest one being a peregrine falcon. And my father's prints are also there. They sell them in the gift shop in the form of box note cards and as matted and unmatted prints.
Okay. Now, so we have a taxidermist who has his artwork and his taxidermy work at Imes Park, who at some point in his life decided he wanted to be a dentist.
Yes, and he had graduated from the University of Tennessee here in Knoxville in undergraduate school, and he went on to the College of Dentistry in Memphis and graduated in 1935 and came back that year to Knoxville to begin his practice in dentistry.
We were talking kind of earlier before the show that a man that could work with his hands and stuff birds and work with his hands to paint birds would also work with his hands to fill the teeth and cavities in people's mouths, and how that would be an artist's work too.
Well, it's interesting the way that I have learned information about my father, and the taxidermy is something that, of course, I never saw him do, but it was just a few years ago that my uncle in Kentucky found a newspaper article from the Knoxville Sunday Journal in 1933 that tells about my father and his taxidermy. And it tells more detail than I previously knew about it. But if there was one important message in that article, it was that my father planned to give up taxidermy after he started practicing dentistry because he thought a patient is not going to come to a dentist who has had his hands involved in doing taxidermy of a bird because it's messy and because there's arsenic involved, at least at that time, in the mounting of birds.
Okay, so I think in that article it said he had to give up his taxidermy for forceps
right,
in order to be a dentist.
Right, that's the way that the reporter worded that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that was in 1933, so he was a 21-year-old man during the Depression who had already graduated from the University of Tennessee and had already become regionally known as a taxidermist.
Right. Now, he would have been about 24 by the time he graduated from dental school.
Okay. Now, so he was a taxidermist, he was an artist, he was a dentist.
And all of those involve the skill of doing detail with your hands. And that was just a natural God-given gift, which he apparently had.
And then he wound up in the Navy. How'd that happen?
Well, I don't know a lot of details, but sometime in 1941, he joined the Naval Reserve. I know he had to go to Nashville to officially become an officer in the Naval Reserve. And that would have been less than a year before the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Okay, so when he enlisted, did he have full intentions of going to Annapolis?
Well, no, he had no idea where he would be assigned, and of course, this is before the war itself started.
Okay, so he went there and said, "Okay, I'm going to be a dentist in the Navy."
He was commissioned as in the United States Naval Dental Corps.
The Naval Dental Corps.
Right.
I didn't know they had a Naval Dental Corps.
Yes.
That's interesting. Okay, but how did he get to Annapolis? What happened there?
Well, Annapolis was his second assignment. His first assignment that we talked a little bit about earlier was that he first went to Parris Island, South Carolina, and that's where he began seriously painting birds. And after being there for a year, he was given orders to report again as a dental officer, this time at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. There were somewhere close to 30 dentists there, I understand, at the Naval Academy. And he was there for a little over a year. And he continued to do his painting of birds. And one of the things that I'm very fortunate happened is that while he was there, a foreign languages professor there had my father for dinner, and while he was there, he made recordings of my father doing imitations of bird calls, which I think I mentioned earlier. He supposedly could do something like 60 different bird calls, and so that's how he got to Annapolis.
Okay, I want to catch the listeners up a little bit. About 3 or 4 years ago, I met Mr. Henry at a gift show in Gatlinburg, and he was up behind a table handing out, had samples of prints of birds, and then I looked up and saw that he had a picture of his father, who was a naval officer, and I had to ask him what those prints were all about. I ran into him again at that same show just a couple of months ago, or maybe a month and a half ago. And these prints are just beautiful works of art that he did while he was at Annapolis, or?
Well, it was Parris Island, South Carolina.
Okay.
That's where he began seriously painting, and then he carried that on at Annapolis. And after he went to sea, he did 4 more paintings that I'm aware of. A couple of them he did aboard ship.
Mm-hmm. And one of the packets that I have is a packet of 12 birds that are postcard size, that have the individual birds on them. And these now you sell these, is that correct?
Yes, I do.
Okay, can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, we have 20 different prints that we had so far. We hope that there will be more that we'll be able to have, but I sell more assortments with 12 different bird card images in it than I do of anything else. And they're all nature prints except one of them that he later painted on board ship, which is I describe as a war poster picture. And I put one of those in all the assortments unless the buyer requests that I not include it, because it's very dramatic and it helps people remember the artist.
And we're going to talk more about how you can get those prints if you want to later on in the show, but I want to go back to a little bit on Earl Henry's history. We've got him in Annapolis, and now he's thinking about going to sea.
My father thought he should take his turn at sea. He didn't have to go to sea, but he volunteered for sea duty, and he received an assignment that most people would have thought at the time was a choice assignment. He was assigned as the dental officer on the USS Indianapolis.
Okay, the dental officer on the USS Indianapolis, and we've already talked about it. Up to this point, it had already been in 9 major battles in the Pacific. What was his job on the ship?
Well, as a dental officer, he had duties, routine dental duties is one of the things, and as well as being part of a medical team. He worked very closely with 2 doctors that were on the ship, and the sick bay and the dentist office were right next to each other, so they became really a team. But as far as the dental work, he wrote about that in his letters a lot, his letters to my mother, talking about the mission. And apparently this was true of most dentists serving during World War II, that they felt a real duty to provide dental service to the sailors and Marines in the Navy, because those boys had grown up in the Depression. A lot of them, their families couldn't afford to send them to dentists. And this was also before the public water systems were treated with before fluoridation of the water supply. And so there were a lot more cavities in a typical young person back then than you would expect to see today. So there was a lot of work to do, and they I know my father took that very seriously.
During peacetime, the USS Indianapolis had about 625 members of the ship, but during wartime it had close to 1,200. I think it's 1,190. So there probably were a lot of dental problems or dental issues on that boat. Your father was probably really, really busy.
I think so.
Okay. But when he was on that ship, I'm looking at one of the printed cards right now. When he was on that ship, he had painted a picture, what's called the American Eagle in the Pacific. Can you take a minute and describe this card?
Yes, I can. That's my favorite painting of his. Now, up until that time, all of my father's paintings were what you would call nature prints. They were of songbirds, shorebirds, birds of prey, whatever, in nature scenes. But this one I call a war poster picture, and it's just beautiful. It has an eagle, very detailed, and its wings are open at an angle, and behind it is the American flag, which was a 48-star American flag at that time. The snake in its talons is gripping a serpent or snake, and it's dripping blood, and tied to the tail of the snake is a tiny, tattered Japanese Army flag. And so it's just full of symbolism of the period and of the place where it was painted in the Pacific. I think that my father was expressing the emotions that the American fighting men in the Pacific felt.
When I look at this card and look at the snake has some pretty mean-looking fangs on it. But those fangs are pretty useless because he is in the claws of the American eagle.
Right, and I think that's the way that that was the way that most Americans felt like the war was going. And I know from my father's letters, I felt like that this war is going to be over before long.
You're listening to The Veteran Next Door, and I'm your host, Randy Baxter, and we'll be right back.
The Veteran Next Door will return in a moment.
You're listening to The Veteran Next Door, and this is your host, Randall Baxter, and we're here with Earl Henry. We're talking about the USS Indianapolis and the life of Earl Henry Jr.'s father, Earl Henry, who was an artist, a taxidermist, a dentist, and an officer in the U.S. Navy. He joined Saipan. He joined Indianapolis when he got to Saipan. Saipan, at that time, had been detaining and was the first ship to enter the bay in Guam, and went into the 10th battle, which they bombarded Peleliu. And that was in September of 1944. When that battle was over, the Indianapolis had to return to San Francisco, to Mare Island. That was in October and November. Is there anything you want to tell us about that, Earl?
Well, that's important to me. I'm really glad the ship came in. I'm really glad my mother joined my father out there for about 6 weeks. And if my mother had not joined my father there, I might not have shown up for this taping today.
And that's true, and maybe his story would never have been told. That's true. That's true. Go Navy. February 1945, after the ship left, they participated in attacking Japan for the first time since Doolittle's raid. And part of that in February of 1945 was the 12th battle that the Indianapolis in was the Battle of Iwo Jima. 1 month later, the 13th battle that they were in, they again attacked Japan. And in Battle 14, they attacked Okinawa. So we've got a ship so far that has been in the South Pacific. It came back home and refitted, then it went to Alaska and fought battles there and went back and refitted, and it came back to help the Marines fight in the island hopping campaigns. It's just been everywhere. It's been in the whole war. But on March 31, 1945, the Indianapolis suffered heavy damage from bombs, and a plane crashed into it. When that plane crashed, it killed 9 crewmen, bent the propeller shafts in the big ship. The fuel tanks were ruptured, and the water distillery was ruined. What was your father doing during that time?
Well, it was a very busy time there between Iwo Jima and the invasion of Okinawa. I might mention that my mother's birthday was coming up, and my father wrote her how busy they were, and he didn't have time. There wasn't any way he could order a birthday present, so he did a painting for her, his last painting on ship that he mailed to her. But specifically, after he did that painting on March the 31st, when the kamikaze plane struck the ship, my father had to identify the 9 sailors who were killed in that kamikaze attack.
Using their dental records.
Using the dental records, right.
Okay, so he wasn't always just in there patching teeth up.
Right.
Sometimes he was a soldier at war.
Right. And there may have been other times when he had to identify casualties with dental records, but that's the only specific instance that I know of.
Okay. And then I think he also wrote you a letter, didn't he?
Yes, although now this was later.
Oh, okay. Well, tell me a little bit about the letter.
Okay. Well, after the invasion of Okinawa and the plane being the kamikaze plane damaging the ship had to come back to Mare Island again and for repairs. My father took a 3-week leave and came to Kentucky and visited my mother, and left right before I was born. And maybe he would have stayed a little longer had he known I was born, but I was born prematurely. I was not expected for about another 6 weeks. That was the last time anybody has ever accused me of being early, I might mention. But my father went back to California, and suddenly they got orders to to depart, and they left San Francisco. And of course, my father would not have known that they were carrying the components of the first 2 atomic bombs, but it was a high-speed mission, and they went to Tinian and delivered the components of the first atomic bomb. And that was July 26th, and the ship went from there to Guam, which was very close by. And at Guam, my father received the first and only pictures that he ever saw of me. And he wrote a little note to me from there. And he did it on the back of a calling card, where on one side it says, Earl Odell Henry, Lieutenant Commander, United States Naval Dental Corps. And on the back of it, he says something like, son, if I can be just as good a father as your mother is a mother, son, you'll turn out all right. Love, Earl. And my father had no idea that would be his last port of call and his last opportunity, but I'm so grateful that he wrote that little note to me.
Okay. So what I have learned in this experience so far is that you have learned a lot about your father by searching and absorbing, and for people bringing you information. So you know your father very well, don't you? I
know my father very well, and I was flattered by overhearing a lady, a former neighbor of mine, after I had spoken to her garden club, telling somebody, gosh, he knows his father better than I know mine. Well, actually, I don't. Of course I don't. But I am so blessed that I know as much as I do, because my father left first so much tangible evidence in his work. The mounted birds, the beautiful bird paintings, dental jewelry that he made, or jewelry he made using dental silver for my mother. And I'm able to listen to my father's voice on the bird call imitations. And I probably know more about my father's personality from his letters. His letters were so rich, and it's amazing because they were censored. He couldn't say where they were or what they were doing, but they was full of information about people he had seen and met, or about letters he had heard from others, received from others, and he was asking questions about how are my mother and father, and things like that. And I've also been fortunate that I come across so much that in reading, accidental discoveries of things about my father, references in a book by the first chief naturalist of the Smokies telling about birds. My father discovered this, my uncle discovered this newspaper article just about 3 years ago that was written in 1933 about my father and his taxidermy, and just members of the family. And there was a point in time, especially when a friend would die, that I would be thinking, I'll probably never learn anything new about my father. And then pop, something comes up totally unexpected. I'm very, very blessed to know as much as I do about my father.
Earl, you've got these prints, and obviously you do sell the prints, but I think you would still do what you do even if you weren't selling the prints. I think you'd be spreading the word and showing your father's artwork. But how can people learn more about getting this information?
Well, if somebody is interested in the prints, they can send me an email, and they can either order, or I can tell them about the prints. And my email address is simply henrybirdprints@aol.com, and my phone number is area code 615-352-1181.
I've got a set of these cards, and I got some a couple years ago and mailed them to my friends. But if you really want a beautiful card to send to a friend or a relative, it doesn't have to be Christmas, because these are just beautiful bird prints. I had a hard time mailing mine out because I didn't want to not have them anymore.
But you can always order more, Randy.
That's right, you can always order more. And I think you can order 12 prints for what?
12 cards for $9.95.
Okay, so that's 75 cents a piece. And these are beautiful cards. You cannot go into a Hallmark store and buy as good a card as these are. I think it might be something that you're interested in. We want to thank Earl Henry a lot for coming and spending the afternoon or the morning with us. If you have any questions, that's Henry
henrybirdprince@aol.com.
Okay, and if you didn't write that down, you can always get in touch with me at randallbaxter@randallbaxter.com. The phone number, if you want to talk to Mr. Henry about anything, about his history or achieving the prince, the number is 615-298-4502. If you really want a nice gift, that's a perfect card.
And Randy, I want to thank you for having me on the program and for telling my father's story.
Okay, well, I'm proud to. I was very interested, have been for years. This is Veteran Next Door. I'm your host, Randy Baxter, and we'll be right back.
The Veteran Next Door will return in a moment.
After repairs in San Francisco, the Indianapolis was ordered to go on a special mission to deliver key parts, to the nuclear bombs that were going to be dropped on Japan. They took those parts to Tinian. They were on the way to the Philippines to another battle. Once they had delivered their parts and left for the Philippines, the Indianapolis was hit by 2 torpedoes on the starboard side. She sank in 12 minutes. The survivors were picked up at the end. There were 316 survivors of the crew of 1,199. The captain was later court-martialed for his actions. He failed to zigzag. He was ordered to get there as fast as he could, but he failed to zigzag. So the first ship to be sunk was the Arizona. The last ship, the Indianapolis. If you had to die connected to the Indianapolis, these were your options. You could have been killed by a Japanese kamikaze pilot. You could have been killed in any of the many battles the Indianapolis participated. If you died when the ship was hit by 2 submarine torpedo blasts, you may have been killed when the front of the ship on the starboard side was hit and broke off the rest of the ship. You may have died in the second torpedo blast that hit the ship in the middle. You may have drowned when the ship went down, if when your manned battle stations were below deck and you could not jump. If you survived the sinking of the ship that sank in 12 minutes when it was hit, and you were a survivor in the ocean, there were originally 800 survivors floating in the ocean. Very few had lifeboats. Most just had life jackets. But you had more tribulations. Some were mercilessly burned. Some soaked in oil that caused their eyes to swell in the salt water so that they could not shut their eyes for days in the heat. Many of the survivors died of dehydration in the Pacific. No food or water, and relentlessly trying to stay afloat for 5 days took its toll. Many went insane and just swam away. Some bled to death from their wounds, and many suffered the worst death of all, being dragged down under the water by the hundreds of sharks that surrounded the survivors and feasted on the helpless survivors until they were found and rescued. Of the 800 floating when the ship went down, a little over 317 or so were rescued. You may have committed suicide, like Captain McVeigh, who could no longer bear the burdens associated with the sinking of the Indianapolis. 4 days after their rescue, they floated in the Pacific Ocean for 4 or 5 days, and then 4 days after that, the first atomic bomb was dropped from Tinian. Bomb with parts that were delivered to Tinian by the USS Indianapolis. Lieutenant Commander Earl Henry was in the medical area when the torpedoes hit, and he went down with the ship. No one knows exactly how he died. He left behind a wife and a newborn child and a series of bird paintings that could last forever. You've been listening to The Veteran Next Door. I'm your host, Randy Baxter. We'll see you next week.
I never was a soldier, but I played one as a child. History was good to me. I grew up free and wild.
You've been listening to Randall Baxter and the Veteran Next Door.